Hi there, it's Matt here and welcome back to the podcast. Today is all about a common sleeping pill and really some fascinating and I think really interesting research that at least I thought would be helpful for general knowledge. The sleeping pill that we're talking about today is Ambien, also known as Zolpidem. And Ambien is a widely prescribed, and it's what we call a non-benzodiazepine sedative-hypnotic. Oh my goodness, there's a lot going on in there. So it's a drug that is of not a certain class, meaning the non-benzodiazepine part of it. It's not a benzo, it's a non-benzo, but it acts very similar to a benzodiazepine. And what it produces is a form of sedation, and that sedation is used specifically for sleep, hence the final part, sedative-hypnotic. Hence, Ambien is a non-benzodiazepine sedative-hypnotic. And it is prescribed specifically for short-term treatment of insomnia, or at least that is how it's designated to be used. As you probably will know, Ambien is often used in much longer duration settings. Some people have not been on it for several months. They've been on it for maybe tens of months. Some have been on it for maybe even a couple of years. And it is unlike a traditional benzodiazepine in that it tickles the receptor in the brain that it targets in a slightly different way. Now, benzodiazepine drugs, things like Valium, they will target what are called the GABA receptors in the brain. GABA is a neurotransmitter, and it stands for gamma-aminobutyric acid. And GABA is the principal inhibitory neurotransmitter in the brain. So that when you stimulate those receptors, what you're going to be doing is shutting down brain activity. The traditional benzodiazepines, as I said, things like Valium and temazepam, they would just target the GABA receptor directly. The drugs like Ambien and some of the other similar drugs like Lunesta and Sonata, those drugs, they do end up activating the GABA receptor and a specific subtype of one of those GABA receptors, something that we call the GABA-A receptor. But they tickle it in a very specific way. They don't really go after it directly. And they target a little smaller site on the side of the receptor. And that little smaller site is what we call a subunit of the receptor. And if you really want to get nerdy and sort of just maniacal in all of the details, which, by the way, none of this you have to need to understand what I'm about to tell you. But for those who are curious, Ambien will tickle this subunit of the GABA-A receptor, and it's called the alpha-1 subunit of the GABA-A receptor in the brain. Oh my goodness. It all makes sense once you understand neurobiology, but trust me, all that you need to know is that Ambien will selectively target this GABA system, this strong inhibitory system within the brain. And it does so in this sort of slightly indirect way by tickling a subunit, a sort of subsection of that receptor. Whereas the classic benzos, things like temazepam and Valium, they will just target the receptor very directly. And the reason that Ambien and Lunesta and Sonata, these types of sort of what we would think of as the second wave, the second generation of sleeping pills, they were trying to do this in a more subtle way so that they could try to still provide a rapid onset of sleep as a benefit of a sleeping pill, whilst trying to minimize some of the broader side effects that are typically seen with the benzodiazepines like Valium and things like temazepam, which really have very strong side effects. But as you will see, it's not to say that Ambien doesn't have its own strong side effects. But really what I want to focus on here today are some research studies that describe not just the impact of how Ambien changes your sleep, but how that Ambien-laced sleep, as it were, Ambien-dosed sleep, changes the functional benefits of sleep and perhaps reduces down those benefits or even impairs them. So just as a recap, what have we learned so far? Because I know that was probably a lot of neurobiology word spaghetti, but Ambien is going to interact with the GABA receptor in the brain, which is the main neurotransmitter system in the brain. It is preferentially going to tickle the alpha-1A subunit, which essentially is going to produce a sedating effect. In other words, hopefully an effect that mimics sleep and has as few side effects as possible. Why do I mention and re-emphasize this whole idea that Ambien tickles this subunit of the GABA receptor called the alpha-1 subunit? Well, it turns out that the alpha-1 subunit of the GABA system is not just involved in sedation and settling down the cortex, it also plays a vital role in something that we call synaptic plasticity. And synaptic plasticity is the ability of the brain to change its information stores based on what you've been learning. And it's through learning during the day and these plastic changes that happen during learning, and then sleep at night, which helps cement those plastic synaptic changes. That's the reason that we are able to form memories whilst we're awake and then hold on to those memories by hitting the save button at night. And as you'll see, because of the role of that alpha-1 subunit of the GABA receptor in learning, memory, and brain plasticity, its alteration by way of Ambien can start to explain some of the well-known memory impairment effects that are consequential to the use of Ambien. So that's going to be the first study that we address, and then the second study is very related to it. It's once again going to describe how Ambien changes sleep and changes it in a perhaps distorted way, and that Ambien-induced sleep distortion ultimately changes a different function of sleep, not just learning and memory strengthening, but also the cleansing of the brain, specifically the cleansing of the brain of toxic components that build up whilst we're awake, including two critical Alzheimer's disease proteins. A long-standing partner of today's podcast is Element, spelled LMNT. Element is a sugar-free electrolyte mix, and for me, it was the sugar-free part of that made me start using it quite some time ago. Beyond having the electrolytes in the right balance, the other reason I'm a fan of Element is that it's scientific. And if you look at the people who created the company, you'll find some pretty heavy-hitting physiology, biochemistry, and pharmacology knowledge that is baked into the product. And again, all of that comes without any sugar. I am a devotee of their product. I really do use them. I know people will say that on these ad reads. I use it every single day for my workout. I put it in my protein shakes afterwards. I do use it. Also, by the way, Element has just recently brought back the chocolate medley range, which you can have essentially your electrolytes hot. And in the trio of flavors, there is chocolate mint, chocolate chai, and also my favorite, chocolate raspberry. And by the way, I happily badgered them to agree to give you fine folks a free sample pack with any purchase of Element if you just use the link lmnt.com/Matt Walker. That's lmnt.com/Matt Walker. But I'm jumping ahead of the game. Let's start with the effects of memory, and specifically the effects of Ambien-laced sleep. and see if we can understand whether or not the brain can still strengthen the connections at night during sleep that it needs to strengthen when it has been dosed with Ambien versus when it has not been dosed with Ambien. And the pivotal study really came from perhaps one of the most respected and the most brilliant sleep scientists in the field, Dr. Marcus Frank, at the Elson S. Floyd College of Medicine at Washington State University. Now, the study, it's fascinating. It's a little bit complicated, but since you listen to this show, I doubt you are fearful of complicated science. And don't worry, I will try to make it as understandable as possible. But here's what he did. It was a great study. He focused on a model of brain plasticity that we use in neuroscience called ocular dominance plasticity. And the way it works is that you will typically patch one eye and you will see how the brain rewires itself to give greater dominance to the other eye that is still getting visual information. So in other words, you shut down one side of the visual world, and after a while, the brain very quickly says, okay, let's not waste that territory. Let's start rewiring that territory and giving it over to the other half of the visual world through the eye that is not patched, and therefore still use all of the real estate of the brain. That fallacy, by the way, that we only ever use 5% of our brain, it's absolute nonsense, one of the biggest myths in neuroscience. But here's what they did. They were able to create this patch over the eye and start to drive plasticity during wakefulness. So now, with only one eye open, the brain already starts to shift its dominance of territory over to the eye that has remaining sight. So the plasticity in the brain, the rewiring of the brain, is already starting to happen. And then what they did was they looked and they allowed these animals that they were studying to then sleep. And sure enough, what sleep did was take that initial plasticity, that initial rewiring, and it started to strengthen that brain plasticity rewiring program even more prolifically, anywhere between 40 to 60% more by way of sleep. So sleep was essentially taking the baton of wakefulness, the plasticity that had already started to happen. And then sleep continued that work of restructuring the neural architecture of the brain at night. Absolutely fascinating. So what does this have to do with sleeping pills? Well, in the next round of studies, they once again patched one eye and they started to drive the brain plasticity change through visual experience during the day. And then they let the animals sleep once more. But this time, after the brain plasticity had started, but just before the animals were essentially put to bed, they dosed the animals with Ambien. What's striking here is that the animals slept even longer with Ambien. And what I just told you is that sleep will further strengthen those plastic changes, strengthen and amplify that learning and memory plasticity. So if the animals, by way of being dosed with Ambien, were sleeping even longer, surely that longer sleep should have helped strengthen that brain plasticity change even more. And the answer was, it didn't. In fact, what happened was that the Ambien-induced sleep unwired the brain by about 50%. So not only did the Ambien-induced even longer sleep fail to produce even greater plasticity benefits, instead, what it did was undo all of the work that had happened even during the day. Ambien-induced sleep was unwiring the memory trace within the brain, and not just by a small amount, by 50%. So despite inducing what appeared to be quote-unquote normal sleep based on how we measure it, Ambien impaired the very processes that the brain relies on during rest to reorganize and consolidate neural connections. And so I think what I at least took from that, and this is just my own humble reading. Again, here I'm not trying to play medical doctor. We're being scientifically descriptive here. We're not being medically prescriptive. But I think what I took away from this fascinating paper is the stark differences here, that not all sleep is equally restorative, that at least from the perspective of this model of brain plasticity, Ambien-induced sleep may seem sufficient to place those animals in a state of non-consciousness, but perhaps it masks a deeper disruption to essential brain processes. Here, the brain processes of learning and memory. So then we can ask, well, what's the mechanism behind the disruptive impact of Ambien on brain plasticity? Well, it really comes back to that GABA alpha-1 subunit, because Ambien has a very strong taste preference for going after that alpha-1 subunit of the GABA-A receptor. And by disrupting the activity of that subunit, we believe that it disrupts the ability of your cerebral cortex to regulate synaptic strengthening, and specifically the timing of that synaptic strengthening during sleep. And because Ambien was causing an excessive activation of that alpha subunit of this strongly inhibitory neurotransmitter, it dampened the neuronal activity that we believe during sleep is still required to strengthen or even prune and make efficient those synapses, which are both processes that are essential for learning and memory. Hence, Ambien's pharmacological action seems to blunt the fine-tuning capacity of the GABA system that helps adaptive brain changes and brain plasticity during sleep. And in fact, that may be one of the reasons why Ambien is associated with significant memory impairments, increased rates of forgetting, and aspects of amnesia during the sleep that you're having on Ambien itself. A partner of today's podcast is Shopify. Why Shopify? As someone who spends his days researching sleep and his nights researching sleep, the idea of selling merchandise was quite daunting. And you're probably thinking, what on earth is he going to be selling? We're going to start with some exciting t-shirts, all with the proceedings going directly to a new sleep education non-profit charity that I will announce later. At the moment that we started to do that, I knew what I wanted to design, but how on earth was I going to get this sleep merch into your fantastic hands? Everyone who gave me answers gave me the same answer, Shopify, and it turned out to be remarkably simple. Without any retail experience, I was able to set up and activate my store effortlessly. Shopify's point of sale system, it's really interesting. It basically just integrates perfectly with all of the different online sales components, and it just manages everything so smoothly. Honestly, it was great. Shopify POS, it handles all the complexities of sales, inventory, and it just lets me focus on my passion, which is sleep science. Try it out. You'll see what I mean about its intuitive platform. But you should also note that Shopify isn't just for online businesses. I've heard, at least from one friend in particular, it really can help revolutionize in-person sales as well. It's one system that seems to integrate everything. If you would like an offer, here is the offer. Shopify have agreed to do a $1 per month trial. It's just $1 a month if you do shopify.com/Matt Walker. So again, shopify.com/Matt Walker. You'll get Shopify for $1 a month. That's nuts. I don't know why they're doing this for me, but it's great. Okay, let's get back to the show. So That was a study that I think was fascinating from one functional benefit of naturalistic sleep, which is for learning and brain plasticity, and how Ambien can disrupt that functional benefit of naturalistic sleep. The second is a paper that literally just came out, and I think it has broader implications, not just for memory, but also for Alzheimer's disease. And here we're going to come on to how Ambien may potentially undermine the brain's waste clearing system during sleep. And I've spoken about it before on this show. The waste system in the brain is called the glymphatic system, named after these beautiful cells that make it up. They're called glial cells. We used to think of them as the gluing tissue of the brain, but they are actually incredibly active and essential for brain function. But they form a network, and that network is called the glymphatic system. Now, you have all heard of the sewage system in your body. It's called the lymphatic system. And now we've discovered that the brain has such a sewage system. It's called the glymphatic system, named after these glial cells that make it up. And what we've also understood is that this cleansing system in the brain, it's not always switched on in high flow volume across the 24-hour period. But instead, that glymphatic system is specifically and preferentially active during sleep, and specifically during deep non-REM sleep. What does that cleansing system do? Well, it washes away all of the metabolic detritus that builds up from wakefulness. And in some ways, it's hyperbolic when I say this, but wakefulness from a biochemical perspective, it's a little bit almost like low-level brain damage, whereas sleep is your sanitary salvation. And this brings us on to the latest study in this series of how Ambien may produce a form of sleep that doesn't transact the normal functions. We've just spoken about learning, memory, brain plasticity, but now we're going to speak about the brain's specialized waste clearing network. Now, it turns out here that we're going to talk about another neurotransmitter system in the brain, because that cleansing system, that sort of power cleanse for the brain that happens at night as we sleep by way of the glymphatic system, is in part controlled by the pulsing waves of activity of a neurotransmitter called norepinephrine. And those pulsing waves of norepinephrine, together with something that we call cerebrospinal fluid, which is this wonderful fluid that bathes your brain and also your spinal cord, these two systems combine, and they allow essentially a flushing out of all of the harmful solutes that have been building up in and around your brain cells at night. So think about it like this. Wouldn't it be incredible if all of the buildings in Manhattan shrunk down at night, and then this incredible cleansing solution pervaded all of the streets of Manhattan and washed away all of the detritus that had been building up during the waking day? Well, that's exactly what happens inside of your brain during sleep at night. In fact, some of the brain cell structures will actually shrink, and they will enlarge the space in between them, what we call the interstitial space between neurons, which is essentially like enlarging the roads on Manhattan Island. And then this cerebrospinal fluid, governed by this norepinephrine neurotransmitter pulsing, will cleanse the brain in these waves of essentially detoxing fluid. And this study came from a group that was the same group that discovered this glymphatic system. And firstly, what they found was that it's this pulsing motion driven by these bursts of norepinephrine that actually synchronize with the throbbing, the pulsing of our vessels that helps synchronize the flushing of the cerebrospinal fluid through the brain. And during sleep, through this beautiful mechanism of a neurotransmitter helping regulate respiration and vasomotor coordination within the brain and all of the blood vessels that surround it, it produces these glymphatic pulsing waves of cerebrospinal fluid. And during sleep, by way of this coordinated mechanism from this neurotransmitter called norepinephrine, controlling the changes in the vasomotor and the blood vessel dilation and the cerebrospinal fluid flow. It's all wonderful stuff. That improves in its efficiency by up to 30% during deep non-REM sleep. And this is where the new study comes in. They were looking to see not just whether sleep was cleansing the brain of all of these pieces of waste products that build up as we're awake, but then what they did was something clever. They looked at naturalistic sleep and the cleansing glymphatic system, and then they looked at Ambien dosed sleep and asked a fundamental question. Does Ambien laced sleep produce the same type of glymphatic system cleansing capacity of the brain as naturalistic sleep? And first, what they found was that Ambien significantly impaired those pulsing waves of that critical neurotransmitter that I mentioned, norepinephrine. And in fact, it dropped the size of those pulses of norepinephrine waves by 50%. And as a consequence, it dropped the rhythmic pumping action that was essential for the glymphatic flow of cleansing solution throughout the brain. And because of that 50% impairment in norepinephrine magnitude of activity caused by Ambien suppression, it reduced the glymphatic clearance of all of that metabolic detritus by 32% in terms of the cerebrospinal inflow to the brain. So in other words, that Ambien-induced sleep was dropping the cleansing capacity of the cerebrospinal fluid through the brain by almost 1/3 across the brain in general. And in fact, you could even see this in usually very protected areas of the brain, memory-related areas like the hippocampus. There, the reductions, which should normally be protected because that's a very sensitive area, that learning and memory area, that was still dropped by anywhere between 20 to 28%. Although we would rate this as at least a preliminary study, an initial study, and we need to see it replicated, of course, but this demonstrates a really quite striking suppression of the glymphatic system, this cleansing system, by way of Ambien. As I've mentioned on this show before, I am a bit of a health fiend, fanatic, I suppose you could call it. The biggest challenge for me, my one kryptonite, is baked goods, especially bread. Oh, I'm a sucker for bread. But the carb count really has kept me away for probably over a decade. A few years ago, I was searching out the possibility of zero net carb breads. And that is when I found my salvation. It was Hero Bread. I have been addicted to them, guilt-free because they are zero net carb, and have been just righteously consuming their product for probably well over 3 years now. And they reached out and asked if I would consider them as being a sponsor of the show. Couldn't believe it. And my go-to is the white bread loaf. And the way I typically do it, I have 2 slices topped with blanched tomatoes, drizzled in balsamic, and then I sprinkle a little bit of Parmesan cheese on top. Oh my goodness, it's laughable how happy it makes me. And as I mentioned, it's not just zero net carbs. It is 0 grams of sugar. It is very high in fiber, superb taste. It's kind of like fluffy texture. It's just hard to believe. You have to try it for yourself, or you don't. It's entirely up to you. I would highly recommend that you do. And if a loaf is not your thing, they've got all sorts of things. They've got tortillas, they've got wraps, they've got tacos, they've got bagels, they've got dinner rolls, you name it. If you are looking for a bread that supports your health goals without sacrificing the taste and the texture, I would recommend Hero Bread. You can get 10% off your order. Just go to hero.co and then use the promotion code Matt Walker, all one word. So that is hero.co, and then use the promo code Matt Walker. In other words, HERO.co, and then just insert the promo code Matt Walker, all one word, and you will get 10% off your purchase. And the consequences that the authors then discuss in the paper, I think, are really quite interesting. And they were focusing on Alzheimer's disease risk. Now, we know that there are purely associational studies, meaning that these are simply epidemiological studies that demonstrate that people who take Ambien are also people who are at a significantly higher risk of going on to develop Alzheimer's disease. But those are simply correlational studies. We have no idea whether one is causing the other. But what the researchers demonstrated here is perhaps at least one mechanism that could parsimoniously explain that association if we end up having evidence that that association is causal, meaning that Ambien-induced sleep is deficient such that it causes the cascade of Alzheimer's disease. We have no evidence of that currently. But nevertheless, the researchers in the paper, I think, made an astute observation that one of the principal functions of the glymphatic system, we believe, in helping combat our dementia risk is the cleansing and removal of two sticky toxic proteins called beta amyloid and tau protein. These are the protein culprits underlying the Alzheimer's disease cascade. And they put forward, therefore, a hypothesis that if Ambien is significantly impairing the cleansing mechanism, as they causally demonstrated it does, then perhaps what that would mean night after night, month after month, and for some people, year after year, you're not getting the full cleansing benefit of naturalistic sleep. And therefore, you would, according to the authors at least, hypothetically still be leaving Alzheimer's disease proteins in the brain that would otherwise have been cleansed if there wasn't Ambien in the system. And therefore, it becomes like compounding interest on an Alzheimer's protein loan, as it were. And it just starts to escalate in this exponential manner, which is very much the exponential pathological curve that we know Alzheimer's seems to fit. So again, I don't think any of this evidence right now is suggesting that Ambien, by way of its impairment of the glymphatic system, is the causal ingredient as to why we see strong associations between Ambien use and Alzheimer's disease risk. None of that is established in these findings, not at all. I think it simply gives us scientific grounds to then create subsequent studies that really do test that hypothesis so that we can either confirm that hypothesis and give people, I think, empowered knowledge of what is going on with Ambien-induced sleep, or we can prove that it's not the case. In other words, we disprove the hypothesis of the authors, and people don't have to necessarily worry about that aspect. So where does this all leave us then? Well, I think it's very clear that if you look across, now the decades, Ambien has certainly assisted millions of people in falling asleep, or at least I probably technically should say losing consciousness more quickly. But it's only really more recently that we're starting to understand the broader influences of Ambien-induced sleep on things like memory, plasticity, glymphatic system activity, and also Alzheimer's disease risk. And for me, at least, this research, and the reason that I wanted to bring it to the forefront is not because I want to be sort of scaremongering or, I'm really trying to be very specific in any of the claims that these papers are making. But I think for me, at least personally, the research underscores the tension that we face. And it's a very difficult tension between treating insomnia symptoms and preserving the integrity of natural sleep architecture. Sleep isn't merely unconsciousness. Sleep is an active, incredibly dynamic state that is crucial for all manner of brain and body functions, including learning, repair, overall well-being, mental health. And I think we just need to be looking to the future of scientific studies to ask the question, does any drug that disrupt these underlying mechanisms pose a long-term health consequence to its users, especially concerning dementia-related pathologies? And I think the Ambien dilemma here, it highlights the need for solutions that perhaps are different than the way it tries to induce sedative hypnosis, according to its nomenclature, sedative-hypnotic. I think perhaps we need to look to solutions that maybe are the new pharmacological tools, and I've spoken about them here on this podcast before, called the DORAS drugs, DORAS. And I should do a podcast on how they impact sleep and how they change the glymphatic system activity. Actually, if I don't do that in the next couple of weeks, can you shout at me on social media and remind me? Because the story there is very, very different. So I think it highlights the need to look to different alternative solutions, perhaps, and also solutions that are non-pharmacological. There is a wonderful treatment for insomnia that's non-pharmacological called cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. I've done a large series on CBTI, or cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, and it aims to recalibrate sleep habits without pharmacologically altering or impairing critical neural processes. And cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, it really aims to recalibrate sleep habits without pharmacologically dampening critical neural processes that unfold during sleep. So I think the studies that I've described here regarding Ambien, they are just examples to illustrate how delicate and interconnected our sleep mechanisms truly are. From things like synaptic plasticity to the glymphatic system, which is the brain's beautiful nightly housekeeping. It's this incredible symphony of a process that, if interrupted by way of abnormal pharmacology, it may change one's trajectory in terms of specific health risks. That's the question that's now on the table. And here, obviously, we're talking about cognitive decline and dementia risk. And so as clinicians and individuals weigh the pros and cons of hypnotics like Ambien, I think these findings at least just serve as a reminder more broadly that true, real restorative sleep, it's more than just a quick fix. It is the cornerstone of lifelong brain health. And with that, I will simply say thank you so much for listening. I really hope that this has been useful. If it hasn't, tell me, and I won't do these things again. By the way, you can come and have conversations with me on social media. I'm there on X as Sleep Diplomat. I'm on Instagram, Dr. Matt Walker, DrMattWalker. And I now have an active YouTube channel that you can come and visit. We are hosting all of the entire back catalog of all of these podcasts are now there for your perusal. And I'm also releasing fresh new content that is not featured on this podcast there on the YouTube channel. And you can find that. The YouTube channel is The Sleep Diplomat. So come find me on the YouTube channel, The Sleep Diplomat. Take care. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.